Now, initially, 2 Samuel chapter 7 appears to be an interlude. We've had civil war, murder, assassination. We've had military victory. We've had the capture of Jerusalem. We've had the Ark of the Covenant going into the city. We've had God striking a man down. And finally, we have a pause to take a big sigh of relief. A nice, quiet chapter where not much happens. Especially as we read at the very beginning of the chapter that David is settled in his brand new palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him. And yet, 2 Samuel 7 is probably the most important chapter in the whole book. And it is one of the most significant chapters in the whole of the Old Testament. If you were doing an overview of the big picture of God's salvation plan, you would certainly pause at this chapter, because in it we see God making a covenant with David. Now, a covenant in human terms is a solemn, binding agreement that can't be altered. Covenants were common in the ancient world. You might have a king or an overlord of some kind making an agreement with his subjects. And in the Bible, God reveals himself as a covenant maker. Only not a distant overlord who's making plans entirely for his own convenience, but a loving, relational God, not content to allow sinners to slip slide to hell, a God who desires a people for himself. And so he reveals himself to Abraham in covenant promise, later to Abraham's grandson Jacob, and then later to Jacob's descendants, to Moses, to all of Israel. These are key moments in Bible history. They're windows into who God is, where he reveals something of his salvation purposes for mankind. And here in 2 Samuel 7 there is significant development. Here, perhaps more clearly than ever before, is revealed the identity of the coming Redeemer. Here in the middle of the Old Testament, the claims that Jesus Christ made about himself are founded. Here is gospel hope, not just for David, not just for the whole of Israel, but for you, for me. So it's a wonderful chapter, and I'm going to split it into 2 halves. We'll look at the second half next week. We'll linger here. Now, today we're just going to look at the first 17 verses where we see David's desire, David's intention, and then simply God's response. And the short version is this. David desires to build a house for God, and God says, no thank you, David, I'm going to do something better. I'm going to build a house for you. Now that's the short version, but I think we'd probably best flesh it out a little bit. Now, the background to what David is wanting to do here goes back a few hundred years to when Israel first entered the Promised Land. And God's promise in Deuteronomy chapter 12 verse 10 was this: you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest from all your enemies around you, so that you will live in safety. Then, to the place the Lord your God will choose as dwelling for his name, there you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices. So there's God's promise that Israel would inherit the land, they would overcome and be given rest from their enemies, and God would then show them the place where they were to worship him. And yet that promise hadn't been fully realised, because alongside the promise was covenant responsibility. Israel were to wipe out those evil, pagan, child-sacrificing nations in Canaan. They were to be wiped out. And Israel hadn't obeyed. They hadn't done this. And as a judgment, God had allowed those nations to remain. And throughout the time of Judges, all the way through Samuel and Saul's lifetimes, right up until chapter 5 of this book, Israel had been relentlessly opposed by enemy nations. Now, yes, there had been periods of rest, but it tended to be localized rest, not nationwide, and the rest as it was tended to be fleeting and fragile. Israel were a restless people. But God's promise hadn't been made null and void. And now suddenly David has rest from his enemies. The Philistines are vanquished. The Jebusites have been turfed out of Jerusalem, and as he sits secure in his royal city, David reflects and he realises that this is something unique and unprecedented. And he knows it's not his doing, it's the Lord's doing. And he may well have recalled that promise of the Lord back in Deuteronomy of rest and directions to the place of worship. So as he reflects upon this, he calls Nathan the prophet his friend, perhaps if you like his spiritual confidant. And he lays it out before Nathan. Here I am, living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. Now it seems a perfectly reasonable and godly desire. David is uncomfortable that here he is dwelling in a beautiful palace, all thanks to God, whereas God's ark, the sign of God's presence, and the sanctuary within which the true king is worshipped, well, it's a very humble affair. It's just canvas. David's concern here is for God's glory, that the ark of God be housed somewhere far more appropriate and more permanent, more glorifying to God. And Nathan, who was a perceptive man, sees this, and his immediate reaction is positive. Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. After all, the Lord was with David. David was God's anointed king. He was a godly man. This is a godly desire. So it must have been quite a shock to Nathan later that night when the Lord spoke to him and said no. Now, before we consider why God said no, I think there's an important lesson here. You see, we don't read here that either David or Nathan consulted the Lord. So they relied on their own wisdom. And they were wise men. They were spiritually minded men. And what they were planning was pure. It came from pure motives. It was a godly desire. And yet these two wise, spiritual men were just men. They lacked the wisdom of God, the all-seeing, the all-knowing, the everlasting, perfect God of heaven. They lacked that wisdom. I think this is a repeated Bible lesson. If you look through the lives of Abraham and the patriarchs, or Moses, or Samuel. Indeed, if you go back to the last chapter where Uzzah died, again and again we see it. When godly people stray from God's word and lean to their own understanding, well, disaster comes, for we lack the wisdom of God. Now, it's a lesson that has to be relearned here, only in a rather gentler manner, that no matter how reasonable or sensible our desires may be, no matter how pure our motives may be, we're not at liberty to just do as we please. We're not to just lean on our own understanding. We are in all our ways to acknowledge him, and he'll direct our paths. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression that I'm advocating a sort of passive sit back with your hands wrapped behind your head, just let God, I don't have to do anything. We are to employ the resources God has given us, and that does include using our minds, our ingenuity, our imagination. We are to push doors, but we're to do such things prayerfully, humbly, asking God to guide us, asking God to overrule for his glory. And we're also to use the wisdom that God has given us in his word. David wrote about it later on. Your word's a lamp for my feet, a light for my path. Now that's our safety as believers, and it's our safety in this church, because it is Christ's church and not ours, and his will must prevail here, and not my will and not your will, his will. We're to always be asking, what does God want? How may I best understand what God wants? Not, well, it's a good idea, other churches are doing it, other people think it's fine, I'll go ahead. So it's the Lord that now speaks into this situation. And in verses 4 to 7, he explains why his answer is, for the moment, a no. Now, I should say that in 1 Chronicles there is additional light shed on this, but we're not looking at that passage today. So we're going to focus entirely on what God says here in 2 Samuel 7. And God begins with a historical reason. I have not dwelt in a house From the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day, I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Now there had been, as I've said already, a certain restless quality to Israel's life as a nation from the time she came up out of Egypt. She'd wandered physically through the wilderness, and she'd wandered spiritually throughout the time of the Judges and beyond. Israel's state was fragile and precarious. Israel had never truly settled. And so God graciously had chosen to share his people's hardships. God had been content, as it were, to travel from place to place, to dwell in a tent. It says something of who Jehovah is and was. In Psalm 103, David writes this: "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we're formed. He remembers that we are dust." And it's this quality of God's, this sympathetic, patient kindness that we see so wonderfully in the New Testament, where in Philippians 2 it says that Christ made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And we remember in the 3 years of his earthly ministry, Christ didn't have a permanent abode. The foxes had holes, the birds of the air had nests, but the Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head. Why? Because Emmanuel was dwelling with us, entering into our restless experience in this world. And given this is how God would one day choose to live on the earth, and how he had freely chosen to operate and deal with Old Testament Israel, it wasn't for David, a mere man, to suddenly and arbitrarily decide that it must stop. And what's more, in verse 7, God basically says, well, I didn't ask for it to stop. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why haven't you built me a house of cedar? It's a bit humorous, isn't it? It's as if, was God really fed up of living in a tent, and was he really pining for a house of cedar? No pun intended there. As if God was actually contained solely in the Ark of the Covenant, or in the tabernacle surrounding it. This is precisely what Solomon acknowledges later. Will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I've built? So really it's a case here of thanks, David, but no thanks. I don't need your pity. I don't need to become your nicely domesticated and contained deity. Remember who I am. I'm the King of heaven and earth. And remember who you are. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? I think it's something that keeps coming out of this book, week after week. God isn't your mate. God isn't a small, parochial, tame, safe kind of God that you can keep locked away and then bring out when you want him. I think the challenger of this book always comes back. Remember who you are. You're a mere creature. And then remember who he is. He's the creator. And it's God that condescends to stoop down and dwell with us. Because if he didn't, we couldn't know him. Because he's holy. It's God that is so kind and gracious as to come down and condescend to be with us. But he's still God. And even if his presence rested on the ark, he was far bigger than the ark. He's holy, he's other, he's apart, he's transcendent. He's vast beyond human measurement. And it's this God that is saying to David, no. And it must have been disappointing, if you think about it, for David to hear this. And in fact, it almost comes across as a rebuke, doesn't it? So he must have been taken aback. But although the immediate desire is disappointed, the Lord is going to disclose a blessing beyond David's imagination. Because you see, the Lord never simply says no to his people because, like a human parent, he's tired, or he's busy, or he's fed up, and he can't be bothered to say yes. It's always because in his purposes he has something better in mind. Even if we don't see that better immediately. Even if it disappoints us in the short term. God does work in mysterious ways to our frail human minds, but he never works in a way that is random or meaningless or unkind or untrue. God sees all things, and he is, as we're very clearly told in Romans 8, working all things for the good of those who trust him. And the Lord's good plans for David are going to be now revealed. Now, first of all, in verses 8 to 11, we get the general picture of what God plans to do. And we see the heart of God, that he really is working for God's good, for David's good, and for Israel's good. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people shall not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from your enemies. Now there's a little reminder of God's prior track record. Don't be disappointed, David. Remember what I've already done. Shepherd boys don't get to be kings, perhaps apart from in Hollywood movies. But this is what God had done for David. He'd already elevated David far beyond his natural station. And that's just for starters. I have becomes I will. Which is always how we should think of the Lord, who is unchangingly faithful and true. We change, he changes not. If he was with us through Christ, he will be, even to the very end of the age. And just listen to the plans that the Lord has for David. He's already been elevated among the people of Israel, but the name David will become known worldwide. I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. Now this is language of covenant, and there are clear, deliberate echoes of God's covenant to Abraham back in Genesis 12, where God says to Abraham, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. But as in the case of Abraham, so too with David. It's not just for David's benefit, it's for the benefit of countless others. God goes on to say, I will provide a place for my people, Israel. I will plant them so they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Now, this is telling us that God is supremely concerned with the security of his people. And the promise given to Israel is this: no more turmoil, no more fear of enemy invasion, instead a safe home to truly put roots in and roots down. And it's with this in mind that the Lord blesses David, so that through David, all Israel might know true, enduring peace and rest. And just as through Abraham many will be blessed, so through David many will be blessed. Under the protection and the wise rule of David, Israel would grow and become established as the light to the Gentiles in that world, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And yet, probably there's something obvious that's troubling you here. We know that this was very short-lived, because within 70 or so years, the glory had faded. That powerful kingdom of Israel was split into two, never again regained its splendour and power. Within about 280 years, the northern tribes were carried off into captivity, never to return. Within 400 or so years, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, the people carried off to Babylon. And although it was Israel's own doing, she broke the covenant, we still might think, well, God didn't really deliver on this promise, did he? It's not much, it didn't last very long. Is that as good as it is? But I think we need to look deeper. This is an enduring promise because it's to do with far more than just military battles or earthly foundations. It is ultimately concerned with spiritual security. And God's never revoked this. He is still supremely concerned with the spiritual security of his people. The Israel within the Israelites of the heart, who truly loved him. For his true followers, God's programme is still very much live. You don't have to turn there, but if we just flick to Psalm 1, what do we read? Blessed is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord. He's like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. So security and blessing continue to be God's promise to his people, to people who trust him by faith. Jeremiah 29, which is given as a prophecy even in the face of exile to Babylon, and God says, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, to not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. All about Zechariah 14, which says of a future Jerusalem, it will be inhabited, never again will it be destroyed. Jerusalem will be secure. Which then takes us right up to the great city of Revelation 21. And so secure are the inhabitants of that great city that we read, on no day will its gates ever be shut, because nothing impure will ever enter it. That's security. You see, God remains supremely concerned for the spiritual security of his people, for your eternal security here today, for mine. I will never leave you nor forsake you. His promise to Israel, reaffirmed in Hebrews 13 for New Testament believers, for us. God's programme of love and protection and blessing, which weaves its way all through the Bible, will run its course all the way to the heavenly Zion and eternity. That's what God is saying here. Now, if that's great, well, from the second half of verse 11, God's covenant promises become mind-blowing. David wanted to build a house for God. And God says to David, no, the Lord himself will establish a house for you. Now, David, of course, was thinking of cedar wood, stone. God is thinking of a dynasty that will continue after every human edifice has crumbled. David will one day die, but God's covenant promise won't die. Verse 12, David will have a successor. David's successor, like him, will be a sinner. And yet, verse 15, sin won't destroy God's covenant promise. God's love to David's family will endure. And most remarkably of all, verse 16, time will not exhaust God's covenant promises. They won't one day be gone and forgotten. David's line will endure forever. Now, obviously, these promises had an immediate fulfillment. When we think of some of the prophecies in the Bible, they have a sort of telescopic quality, like a telescope. They see near and they see far. And so these promises do see into the very near future. God is providing for the coming decades for Israel. David's kingdom wouldn't collapse when he died. He's going to have a son who will share his love for Jehovah, a son to continue his line. God will raise up Solomon to do what David wasn't allowed to do. Solomon will build God's temple. And under Solomon, Israel will reach the zenith of its earthly power and prestige. Now, Solomon wasn't perfect. He had his father's weakness. He took many, many wives, and they led him away from Jehovah. And yet Solomon wouldn't go the way of Saul. Not because Solomon was wonderful in himself, but because of grace. In grace, the Lord would treat Solomon as a son, not like he treated Saul. Verse 14, I'll be his father. He shall be my son. Yes, when he does wrong, he's going to be punished with the rods of men and floggings. But God says, my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. So this is extraordinary grace to David. David is being told, your dynasty won't be short-lived like Saul's. Saul's didn't survive his son. But David's house isn't going to collapse at the first sign of pressure, which is what tends to happen, doesn't it, to earthly houses and earthly dynasties. But David's house will be different. It will endure for many hundreds of years, even allowing for sin and imperfection, because the Lord is its founder, its centre, its driving force. Now Solomon knew this because he wrote in Psalm 127, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labour in vain." I've said this before, but I'll say it again. We could build a fantastic new church building to replace this old failing one where the smoke alarms go off and there's damp up in the roof and everything. We could have this wonderful new building and we could be phenomenally successful and be packed out with hundreds of people every week. But unless it was done in humble faith and trust in the Lord, unless the Lord is the cornerstone, it wouldn't last. Whereas equally, however small or humble an enterprise is, if the Lord is the one at the centre, then what is built will endure. And this is what God goes on to say. And this is where David and us truly realise that this is a promise that goes far beyond ancient Israel, far beyond the next few decades. This is about God's eternal provision. Verse 16, "Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." You see, above and beyond Solomon, and beyond a few hundred years perhaps, this covenant is pointing to a far better king of a far better kingdom. But just as it goes far into the future, so it goes far, far back in the opposite direction, to before this world even existed. Because in eternity past, a solemn covenant agreement was made between God the Father and God the Son. From among sinful, fallen humanity, the Father would choose a people for his Son, a people to live in perfect eternal union, a spotless and blemished bride, an Israel of the heart, made up of Jew and Gentile, male and female, slave and free. And the Son would pay for the rescue of these people. And so Christ the Son came down from heaven in the person of Jesus, and he was born into where? The royal line of David. His earthly father Joseph and his mother Mary could both trace their lineage back to David. Jesus truly was great David's son, but he was his greater son because he was Emmanuel as well. He was the King of heaven in human flesh. So Jesus was both David's son and David's Lord. He was the Messiah of whom David was just a foreshadow. And on earth, Jesus lived and died to pay the covenant price. He paid all of the obligations of the covenant so that all who trust in him can receive its blessings. And on the night before he died, Jesus took the cup at supper time and he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." David wanted to build God a house using cedar wood and stone, but Jesus built God's house with his body and his blood. The true king received all the curses, the covenant curses of our disobedience, so that we needn't receive them, so that we might be counted righteous and live in God's eternal kingdom in heaven with God's forever king on his forever throne. Because, of course, Jesus' death wasn't the end. He rose triumphant from the grave, and this very day he's highly exalted in heaven with God. He's enthroned in the heavens, and he's waiting there for the day when he will come to carry all who trust him to be with him forever. And on that day, at the end of time, there'll be no tabernacle, and there'll be no temple of wood or cedar, and there'll be no church building like this one, or no Westminster Abbey or anything like that, but something far better, because Revelation 21 says, "I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They'll be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God.' So the God who stoops to come among us will one day live forever with us. Is it secure? After all, we know, don't we, that we're no different to Old Testament Israel. We do wander from the covenant so often. Can we lose our salvation? Can we wander from grace to the point where we can't get back? And I think you know the answer to that question. The eternal covenant was a binding one. It was made by the God who doesn't change and cannot lie. It can't be revoked. It can't be gone back on. It was settled long ago. And its basis is not our obedience, not our works, but the work of Christ and the obedience of Christ at Calvary. This is a covenant of love and grace. That's how much God cares about your security and mine. Did David realise this? Well, he didn't have the gospel light we have. But I think you only need to read the Psalms to see that David saw further and more clearly than we perhaps think. And David's response in the second half of the chapter tells us that David saw something of the wonder of this. He's blown away by it. He sees it as grace. Just think, today, David's name is great. Like the names of the greatest men of the earth. 3,000 years after he's died, we still remember David. His name is known across the world, but it's not primarily because of his greatness, but because of his greater son, Jesus, son of David. It's unbelievable. David just wanted to do this small thing for God, and God had said no in order to bless David and bless us all far beyond our imaginations. It reminds us of that lovely prayer in Ephesians 3. It says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us." What is that power? Well, it's the power of the gospel. It's the power of covenant love. It's the power of the Redeemer. Christ crucified, risen and exalted. David saw it in part and it thrilled him. We see it in full. And you couldn't make it up. It's far beyond our feeble minds to have invented. And I think perhaps the enduring lesson from this chapter is that such love is worth being blown away by. Let me close with the words of an old hymn. It says, "Far beyond all human comprehension, measured by an infinite dimension, wonderfully broad in its intention, is the boundless love of God. Greater than my sin and condemnation, great enough to give me full salvation, and to fill my soul with jubilation, is the matchless love of God. Deep enough for those in degradation, higher than the highest elevation, broad enough to take in every nation, is the boundless love of God." Amen.